Okay, so a confounded experiment. It sounds like I'm cartoon swearing, doesn't it? Have you ever watched Yosemite Sam? Because he'll say, confound it. A confounded experiment is when an extraneous variable varies systematically with the independent variable. So an extraneous variable is anything other than the independent variable that might serve as an explanation for what you're seeing. Okay, you'll notice this is a hyperlink. This is a link to a YouTube video of a horse that the owner claims can do cube roots and square roots. I'm a little suspicious. I don't know about you guys. So you might want to take a second and watch that video and see if you can think of any extraneous variables. And what I do when I watch the video is I think of an extraneous variable and then I test it. Like I wait to see if that my explanation still accounts for what I'm seeing. Every extraneous variable that I've thought of that's observable and systematic has not panned out, but that doesn't mean that the horse can do cube roots and square roots. That is for sure. It cannot do that. But you go ahead and watch that video and see what I mean by an extraneous variable. What I'm talking about is anything other than, in this case, the independent variable is claimed to be that the horse has math skills. See if you can think of anything else that seems to vary systematically with this horse's so-called math skills and see if you can explain it. And then come on back here and we'll talk about another example, which is bottle feeding. Okay, well, I'm going to assume you watched the video and probably came up with ideas. In class, we always come up with ideas like, well, maybe it's which hand she's holding it in, maybe she's switching back and forth, but that doesn't usually pan out. We have generated the hypothesis that it's the color of the number, and then that doesn't pan out. I'm really just left with the interpretation that there's something going on outside of camera range that accounts for it, something that is not part of this so-called experiment, that is some extraneous variable that we can't witness because we can't see everything, like somebody's poking the horse in the correct flank or something. I don't know what it is, but it's an extraneous variable, something that's varying systematically with the independent variable. Until we can gain control over all things in that situation, though, there's no way to know what that extraneous variable might be. And as long as it's an uncontrolled test, the simpler explanation of what you saw in that video is that there's a trick involved, that there's some kind of subterfuge going on. Until we can gain control over all the variables, we have to assume that there is something that is interfering with what we're directly observing. Something else is going on. Okay, let me give you a different example that's based more on research, which is the link between bottle feeding and the development of diarrhea. Charming topic, sorry, but it's a great example. Okay, so the independent variable is bottle feeding or not, right? You always have to have at least two conditions. And so we were talking about the true group designs. We have participants who are feeding with formula or breastfeeding. And then we're looking at the dependent variable, which is whether the baby develops diarrhea or not. Research has consistently shown that babies who eat from bottles are more likely to develop diarrhea. But that's research glossed across a whole bunch of different circumstances. And there are some confounds involved in glossing out over all these different circumstances. Factors that have been examined are things like the confound of mother's education. If you have a mother who is not very well educated and is bottle feeding, maybe she doesn't have proper awareness of the importance, the critical nature of proper hygiene with the bottle or clean water to be used as the the mix with the formula. And that, so maybe it's the unclean bottle or the unhygienic water that's causing the diarrhea, and all of that is happening because mom is not properly educated about the critical nature of hygiene while using a bottle. There's another way that mother's education could be a confounding variable because if you're talking about in developed countries, The more highly educated the mom is, the more likely she is to breastfeed. So you have this compound of mother's education level leading to the choice to breastfeed, which may also lead to factors that make it less likely that the baby would develop diarrhea, like maybe a more hygienic household, maybe more hygienic health practices around the baby, things like that have nothing to do with actually what the baby's consuming and everything to do with the circumstances surrounding it. All these compounds that are systematically varying with the independent variable, so-called what the baby's being fed. Whenever there's an extraneous variable present, it's impossible to draw a cause and effect conclusion. So I got a couple videos for you to watch. This first one, I only usually show the first like 4 minutes of it, where they're introducing this girl who has, she's on the autism spectrum, and she's been, they use facilitated communication with her, and she's able to go to school and report how she's feeling and stuff like that now that she's got facilitated communication. Now there's another case in the one that says conclusion, and this one is another video of a person who's claiming to use facilitated communication, but in this case with a person who is in a vegetative state. And what you're going to look for is the possibility of an extraneous variable that makes it impossible for us to be able to accurately draw a conclusion about whether the person in the vegetative state is actually communicating or not. And they did a little experiment, and it's an interesting piece. It's got subtitles because it's in Dutch. So check those out if you have time. They're really interesting examples of the presence of extraneous variables, really leaving the issue with extraneous variables when you have a confounded experiment is that it makes it possible for alternative explanations to be introduced. Maybe it's not whether you're consuming formula or you're being breastfed. It's these other things that are important in determining whether you develop diarrhea. Maybe it's not whether you can do cube root calculations as a horse. Maybe there are these other factors that determine which card you're picking. Things like that. That's the issue with the confounded experiment. We can never confidently know whether our independent variable is the important factor or whether the extraneous variable is the important factor. Now, one thing that can happen in our research design, in our experimental design procedure, is that if we start off with groups of participants that are not equal in the beginning, we can introduce a confound in our experimental design. So we need to have at least 20 participants and either use a randomization procedure to ensure that the groups start out equal at the beginning, or one of those non-randomized protocols and just admit this is not a true experiment. I had to use a non-randomization technique to ensure equality at the beginning. All right, dependent variables. We refer to these as DVs. Dependent variables are going to be the response or the behavior that is being measured. So I've got just some examples here on this chart of things that could serve as dependent variables. Anything that can produce a number really can serve as a dependent variable. So it could be your score on any kind of test, your score on an opinion poll, or anything. It could be anything that we think will depend on your experience with the independent variable. The way that I memorized independent and dependent variables are that the dependent variable depends on the independent variable. Here's a little cartoon that phrases it slightly differently. The independent variable says, nothing you do affects me. I'm independent. And then the dependent variable says that some things you do affect me. That's the idea with the dependent variable. Your score on the dependent variable should be a function of whether you were in the experimental condition or the control condition. That's the basic idea. Our goal is that changes in the dependent variable are directly related to the manipulation of the independent variable. So, like I said at the beginning, the independent variable is like the whole reason why we're conducting the study, to find out whether it has an effect. Well, this is what we're trying to find out if it has an effect on the dependent variable, your score on some measure. Okay, I'm going to stop here and we'll come back in the next segment and we'll talk about how we can record or measure the dependent variable.